Hi, welcome to the Digital Writers Festival panel today on free speech in the Asia Pacific. My name is Sunili and I'm going to be moderating, and I'll just quickly introduce the panelists, and I'll get them to wave and say hello after each person is introduced. So we've got Eleanor Jackson, who's an editor-in-chief and poetry editor. She's a Filipino-Australian poet, performer, arts producer and radio broadcaster for 4CCZ FM, and is artist in residence at La Boite Theatre.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great, and then we've got Andre Dow. He's a writer, fiction and non-fiction, and is editor at Right Now, a human rights media organisation, and he's editor of the Emerging Writer for the Emerging Writers Festival.
Hi everyone.
And finally, we've got Dr. Ross Capsule, who's a lecturer at ANU. He's a researcher on media in Indonesia and Malaysia, and was the recipient of the Australian Endeavour Postdoctorate Award for his project on press freedom and media ownership in Indonesia.
Hi from Jakarta, everyone.
Great, welcome, and I'm so glad to hear you all and see you all. We just want to note quickly that this is supposed to be a really interactive event, and we welcome comments and input from everyone online out there who's watching. I hope people are watching, using the hashtag DWF15. This topic has grown over the past month or so to discuss freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of expression quite generally. But we did originally get the impetus for this by the Charlie Hebdo incident earlier in the year, and so we will talk a little bit, I guess, about the question of where religion comes into it. We haven't got anyone from a Muslim background, unfortunately, because of the trying to get the panel together, and we would really welcome questions from out there in the internet, and questions and comments, and we are online getting those all fed in, so hope to hear lots of feedback on our discussion today. Yeah, do any of you guys want to start in terms of the question about the definitions of freedom of speech and sort of rounding our, starting this off in terms of focusing on what we mean by freedom of speech and freedom of expression? Andre, maybe?
Sure, I guess. So definition of freedom of expression. I think, so what I sort of looked at in our chats before this session, I guess, was sort of ideas looking beyond how we have come to understand something like the strict interpretation of freedom of expression that probably exists now in most Western countries, and then at the international level through international human rights law. But I guess the legal definition comes from a liberal, like philosophical liberal background, and my question, I guess, was around whether or not we can rethink freedom of expression, not only as, we often think of it as, the right for people to say what they want, which is, I guess, a form of formal equality, so everyone has the same right to speak, but whether or not we need to rethink that so that it allows for substantive equality, so maybe rephrasing it as, everyone having the right to be heard, particularly so oppressed or minority groups that are normally silenced. So if we're talking about freedom of speech, maybe we also be needing to think about how do we actually ensure that people not only have the right to speak out, but they're heard.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And we've also sort of been seeing quite a vicious debate, I guess, here in Australia in relation to freedom of speech and minorities. And there's of course the question of, is there ever not going to be a debate on this issue, because of how sort of fraught it is on every side and every angle. Okay.
I'm so conscious that my dog has just started barking at this exact instant that it's worth weighing into the conversation. But Andre, I think it's really valuable to try and revisit some of those classic political notions of a universal right to freedom of speech, and I think it's incredibly important for me to acknowledge that I'm neither an academic nor a qualified solicitor nor somebody who's a religious scholar. So these are all areas that I really try to grapple with as a practicing editor, but they're certainly not places where I feel I have a deep and detailed knowledge of the scholarly debate. And yet, at the same time, the work that Peril does is really focused on an assumption that there is a public way to enact your right to seek and receive and impart information and share opinions. Do you know what I mean? Like, we exist as a publication that hopes to be a part of a kind of very open-ended democratic dialogue that says, if you wish to control my life in particular ways, then I have particular opportunities for accountability, and I do that by being a part of this kind of participatory media. But it isn't, I don't think even in a kind of Western sense, and I think that's grounding it here because we write and produce work in Australia at Peril. There are always quite significant existing government controls against those freedoms, and I guess I'm just very curious where blasphemy sits as a particular kind of control, and if we see that becoming increasingly relevant because it's a media hot topic, or if it's something that really is about a kind of grind between a secular and pluralistic society and very deeply held and very important beliefs and the sociality of religion, which I think is often very infrequently exercised in Australia. So I guess I'm simply echoing a general kind of yes, Andre, I think it's valuable to revisit the definitions, and I never know what's my kind of layman's rule or something I made up for myself. And then I am curious as to whether or not the question around blasphemy is something that we make a kind of juggernaut hot topic because it's sexy in the media, or because it really does reflect a tension point between where our communities are, or the clash of civilizations, even though I kind of hate invoking that phrase because I'm going to do it in a really lazy, non-academic way too. Ross, do you want to improve this definition? Be like, thanks for that meandering pastiche, Eleanor.
I actually did have a question on Ross based on that question, that thing that you raised, Eleanor, in relation to the bridge between government and religion and culture. And I wondered, Ross, if you could sort of teach the rest of us about what you've noticed and what you've theorized about from your research in Malaysia and Indonesia, about how governments play on the question of free speech in relation to culture and society and government.
Sure. So I guess more broadly, not just specifically on Indonesia and Malaysia, but we can talk specifically later, but more broadly on the theoretical question. I guess it comes down to your role of authority, or the role of the state. And if you want to just categorize, as academics often end up doing, if you want to categorize the two models, the first model is people who think that if the masses are not controlled, and there aren't some form of laws or regulations or guidelines or enforced guidelines, then there will be too much freedom, too much discussions on various topics, and people will be insulted, and therefore you need a regulatory body or a state or a religious institution which stops or at least limits that freedom of speech. And of course, there's all limits to freedom of expression in some way or another, even if we're just talking about child pornography laws or something. There's nothing that exists where there is no limit to freedom of expression or freedom of the press in some ways. Or the other model is the model which says that the more powerful the state, the more likely they are to crack down on future dissent or expand on those laws. And so what we need is a limited model where the state or religious institutions can't meddle in at all, or as little as possible, in the way that humans interact. So a lot of it comes down to what's your view on the general masses? What's your view on the populace? Does the populace need to be controlled, and does freedom of expression need to be controlled because it will turn into riots and religious riots and race riots and these kind of things? Or do you think the state needs to be controlled because otherwise it becomes too powerful and looks to work in its own interests? And that really comes down a lot to history and politics of each region or country.
And that's an interesting point in terms of the discussion about freedom of speech as a universal, a universal concept, and human rights in general, and then the questions that were, and the issues and the rejections, I guess, that have been raised over the past, 20 years from Asian countries, just in terms of the conflict between human rights and Asian values. Andre, I wonder if you wanted to sort of give us your thoughts on that dichotomy.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting that, Ross, you raised the idea of, I guess, certain forms of expression leading to things like race riots or religious riots. In terms of the limited knowledge that I have of these issues in the region, with the Asian values debate that happened in the early 90s, and say somewhere like Singapore, which was a leading proponent of that argument, if you look at what the politicians would say, or the way that they justify some of their more repressive laws, they would hark back to particular race-related or religious-related violence, and political violence as well, particularly with like the spectre of communism in the region, from much earlier in their history, or at the very conception of Singapore. So in some ways, I know that in the Singaporean context, it's all of the repressiveness gets at least outwardly justified by reference to this violence, which this very safe state came out of this sort of violent beginnings, and they're always harking back to that. And yeah, so I guess in terms of the universality of human rights and that challenge to it with the Asian values, the idea of Asian values, I think most commentators have come to see that as a bit of an apology for power, in terms of the specific governments like Malaysia or Singapore or China that would raise those arguments, that it was an apology for power. But at the same time, there is something in terms of looking at the specific racial and religious makeups of some of these societies, and the fact that there might be legitimate reasons to think that there are some tensions there that make a universal conception of rights, which one thing that I always find fascinating about the philosophical background of universality is it comes from the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who's a German philosopher who I think he never left his hometown. He came up with the idea of cosmopolitanism, or didn't come up with it, like a real proponent of it, but barely saw the world. He sat and theorized from this small village in Germany. And I think it's interesting then if you compare that then to someone who might be a philosopher sitting in Jakarta or sitting in Kuala Lumpur and thinking about these issues, and maybe they're thinking that there are actually different conceptions of how to regulate speech and how to prevent violence.
And that's sort of interesting in terms of that question of how to regulate it, because I've been wondering about the opposite of what freedom of speech is, which is the control of speech, and the regulation, Ross, as you raised earlier. And I've always contemplated this question on looking at what would be the purpose of any control that was, that was put on speech and expression, in looking for nuances and in looking for ways around understanding this question. And I guess you've seen the question of pornography, Ross, that you raised, and then away on the other hand, I'm originally from Sri Lanka, and under the previous really authoritarian regime, there was the example of how newspapers were controlled in terms of trying to avoid dissent against the government. And this is just something that is so difficult because when you're talking about freedom of speech, there's always the question of the responsibilities that come with the rights, which again is really difficult to balance. Does anyone have any sort of views and approaches that they've contemplated and that they've thought about on that question of the balance? Eleanor, you're smiling there.
I am smiling, but in part because I wanted to ask another question. So I was like, oh, do I have any comments? No. Oops. I'm worried.
We can always come back to it. So if you want to jump in with your question, go ahead.
Look, and I guess, I think this is obviously a valuable and perpetually important discussion to kind of flesh out the ethical debate between, as Ross pointed out, the desire or the perception that one needs to control the populace or the perception that one needs to control government's force and power over it. I think that the tension of that debate moving across of like, is this hate speech or just annoying? Is this pornography or is this art? Like, I think that actually really healthy societies are built in the tension of those discussions. So I think it's incredibly valuable that we're continuing to revisit that here, and notwithstanding examples from anywhere in the world and our immediate region where control of press freedoms or art or censorship is, they go through various peaks and troughs. But I wondered, Ross, if your area of research is, and as Sunil mentioned earlier, we're not really drawing in any writers or academics here that bring a lived experience as a Muslim person to this conversation. So acknowledging that that is really an empty place of this debate. Do you know what I mean? I'm very curious about the specificity of blasphemy, like as opposed to libel or defamation or inciting to violence or anything like that. And in a very, I don't know if it's the world's most populous Muslim nation or just, do you know what I mean? I presume that Indonesia is still the most populous Muslim country in the world. Either that or whoever's got more than 220 million, just jump in and correct me because I was rubbish at geography and world populations. And I just want you to know how much I fed my dogs before this started. I was really hoping to dope them up on food because they don't like being left alone knowing that you're in the house. Sorry about that. But do you feel that, there are only some 30 plus whatever it is nations that continue to maintain penal codes or criminal codes that include blasphemy. How do you see that playing out in Indonesia today? What is it specific to blasphemy as opposed to some of those other limitations to general freedom of speech that you think is of critical importance? I can make noise in the meantime. I think it's frozen.
We lost Ross just when we asked him a question.
Sorry. And look, and maybe Ross will rejoin us in just a second, but it's I'm kind of trying to acknowledge and think about my own context. I'm Filipino-Australian. I was raised Catholic, and as a person who sees themselves as sort of mostly as not agnostic, if still suffering from the cultural overhang of being raised Catholic. The last person that I heard really invoke blasphemy was George Pell and the piss cries hanging for the NGV. So, the last person to invoke this particular kind of law, which sort of has like a residual kind of leftover third nipple effect in the Australian legal system, was a person who I generally use as my moral and ethical barometer for stuff I disagree with. I was like, George Pell likes it, I must have a problem with it. And so I'm curious, in a very large, active, vibrant populace that has, you know, in many ways, great recognition for media robustness and media freedom. Like, do you know what I mean? I would say that Indonesian media is extremely fertile and rich area for debate. So I'm wondering, when Ross comes back on, if he might have some specific examples of how that particular context views blasphemy, because, and apologies that my research is certainly not cutting edge or very detailed, but I have friends who fondly recollect Malaysia in the 60s as being an area which, although a Muslim country, where it was not necessarily standard that all women were observant in their dress, or that all men grew a beard, or that, do you know what I mean, that a certain way of becoming more fundamentalist or more intensified, even though I'm not comfortable with either of those words, even though I just used them, but that those changes have been wrought across many places in Southeast Asia as the Islamic world has become more connected, as it is more media linked. Like, you know, I'm just wondering, I guess, what's changing, what's coming back.
I think we definitely need to wait for Ross to come back.
Sorry. I know, I feel very bad to have asked a very detailed question and now trying to pad during the silence.
So Eleanor, then, I wonder if we can skip on while we're waiting for Ross. Oh, hang on.
Oh, we've got Ross.
Ross is sort of on his way. So we can. Hi, welcome back. Sorry.
Sorry.
No, we're just going on to the question of specific examples of blasphemy, and I just want to read out a little bit from an email that we had from a previously. We were going to have Maggie Tiojakian, and I apologise if I pronounced your name wrong, who was going to be on the panel but is unavailable, and her comments while we were preparing for this discussion was it was about how in 2012 my publisher was forced to burn hundreds of copies of a book by Douglas Wilson and recall thousands more from the market titled 5 Cities That Ruled the World, which had been translated into Bahasa Indonesia and which the Prophet Muhammad had been depicted as a pirate and a murderer. More recently, in July 2014, the chief editor of the Jakarta Post was accused of blasphemy and is now facing potential jail time for publishing a cartoon showing a man raising a flag emblazoned with the Arabic phrase, "There is no God but Allah," over a picture of a skull and crossbones surrounded by masked men with guns that was meant to criticize the ISIS movement. After a string of protests from Islamic groups, the paper published a front-page apology and retracted the article several days later. Eleanor, if you want to mute your thing, that might be a good way.
I don't know how. Let me just be a little bit. Let me try this. Hang on. Yes, I can do that.
Okay. After a string of protests from Islamic groups, the paper published a front-page apology and retracted the art piece several days later. In both cases, insiders have provided off-the-record comments that, in retrospect, they probably would have decided against publishing the work, while the decision was still theirs to make in the editorial room. Ross, I wonder if you can sort of give us a little bit more information about the Jakarta Post incident, as well as several others that you know of involving social media and blasphemy prosecutions. That would be really.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really contentious issue at the moment. Obviously, part of this really comes back to the role of the state and the role of Islam in the state here. And in Indonesia, what you have, as Eleanor mentioned, is a majority Muslim population, but without Islam and the state formally, they're a separate, formally separate role of religion in the state. So what you often get is religious groups really, I guess, trying to show that they want to have some role in the way that society works, if not through the actual formal regulation. And so what's happened in this Jakarta Post case is that they believe that a blasphemy incident occurred by a cartoon, and then it's the chief editor himself that faces potentially 5 years in jail, as is the case with all news organisations. It's the chief editor who's ultimately responsible. Now, what's interesting there is that Indonesia has a press council, which is part of the state, and there is a press law. And so the secular crowd, I guess you'd call, would say that this should really fall under the role of the press council and the role of the Ministry of Information and Communication, and whether, if there's a complaint, it should go through those formal government bodies. But of course, religious groups say, no, this is the blasphemy law. We should be able to mount our complaints and prosecute for blasphemy. So it is a really interesting one. And I think when a lot of these Islamic leaders speak out, and in fact, in many cases, we just saw quite a funny example. Selfies in Indonesia that it's not, shouldn't be done, and get their voices out. These Islamic leaders feel that the state is too secular and the the press is too secular, and there needs to be more of an Islamic influence here. In Malaysia, it's a bit different because of the connection between Islam and the state, but certainly we've seen a number of cases on social media, as you mentioned, Sunili, where Indonesians, if you surveyed a huge bunch of Indonesians, most of them would say, yes, we need a blasphemy law. We need a blasphemy law because there's got to be some repercussions or consequence if you insult Islam. So most would be in favour of the idea of a blasphemy law. But then when a lot of Indonesians also want to speak out on social media, and so we've seen cases where people really, they have a bad day, or in one case in Sulawesi, someone wrote about the mosque being really loud next door and used the term kind of bastards, don't they realise that there's other people that live here too? And then he was put in jail for 9 months for blasphemy law. Now, so again, if you surveyed a bunch of Indonesians, a lot would say that a blasphemy law needs to exist, but they'd also say, hey, but I want to be able to write what I want on social media. So this is the kind of convergence of the two that we're getting to here, and particularly here in Indonesia, where freedom of speech is incredible. A lot of Indonesians write whatever they feel like on social media, and freedom of the press is generally quite good here, as opposed to in Malaysia. So I hope that gives kind of some idea of the connection to politics and Islam that is important in these discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, for that. It's definitely so interesting just to see the panic that social media, I think, has caused governments across the world in terms of their inability to control the masses, the populace, and the sort of tension that's arisen as a result of governments trying everything they can, from Australia's government trying the internet filter situation, and then all the way along to the prosecutions that we've seen happening in Indonesia. That's really interesting, and a question that Maggie had also raised in our previous email discussions is something I wanted to sort of give to the panel, which was sort of about how do we respond to these really delicate questions. And Eleanor, I wonder if you might be able to share sort of your thoughts on your considerations as an editor in how to deal with these questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just kind of mulling over some of Ross's comments, because I think one of the, and thank you so much for answering that ably, even with the dropout, because I was conscious that I then had to provide a very padded précis of a whole bunch of much more complicated issues to fill in the dead time. But I am still really curious as to the way that blasphemy functions to perhaps encourage or somehow justify extrajudicial violence. So do you know what I mean? Like often in countries like Australia, we can take a great comfort that the state regulates violence. So if you are doing something that is blasphemous, then we will punish you or give you a fine or we will control you in some way. In places where the death penalty and significant imprisonment is a potential outcome of a blasphemy charge, I guess I feel like that is significantly less comfortable a dialogue to have, and that making the comments that I'm about to make now come from a place of immense luxury, that I am both not faced with these questions as an editor day to day, and that I'm also doing so in a context that I think has really acknowledged that blasphemy is quite hard to prove and hard to defend, and in a free and tolerant society, religions are also open to critique, and that's a question of ethics, not really metaphysics. So similarly, thank you for letting me provide those comments, but I feel like they come from just an enormous place of luxury. I'm not an Afghani woman thinking about publishing feminist statements that question stoning for women. Do you know what I mean? Like the stakes are so incredibly low for me as an individual. I feel like it's so hard to comment. But obviously I think it's like so many of the editorial questions that we face at Peril, which for those who don't know the publication, we look predominantly at promoting issues of Asian Australian arts and culture, and we take a very broad definition of that, and we want to empower people's creativity and to enable them a platform to share those representations and to have a really engaged dialogue through art around what it means to produce art, be in a society, and to give life to a culture. And so we want that work to be intelligent and thoroughly researched and to meet good standards of journalistic integrity, and that it's accessible for people to voice their opinions in response to it. And so were we to receive work that was, I guess, intended as satire but really walked close to the line of offensive, by and large, I think that our stance would be that we are a publication that looks to foster pluralistic debate, and it does so by trying to provide a safe place for critique, not by being at the very cutting edge of satire and edgy humour that is going to be the shot that awakes the nation. Do you know what I mean? Like, we really have quite strongly stood behind the defence of 18C and 18D more recently, I guess, in Australia, really saying that we do believe that there are some necessary breaks on freedom of speech, particularly in ways that are around deliberate intentions to offend and insult and to humiliate particular groups. So I guess from a Peril perspective, when we have the place of reaching a question of like, is this funny or is it offensive? We obviously have to apply certain journalistic standards around, is it researched and thorough and credible, or did you sit down one day and just need to get something off your chest?
Man, really?
No? I can't tell if someone was asking me a question. Oh, I think Ross dropped out again.
I'm here, sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, we want to try and apply some very basic journalistic standards, and then obviously if something were to be, I guess, deemed more controversial, then we would be looking to consult with affected communities. So asking someone who is a nominated spokesperson for a particular community and area to be like, would you provide comment on this article? So opening up the debate before it's published. But as I've said, I think we really do so with some relatively low stakes in an international scale. Certainly, though, I welcome if Andre or Ross, you have thoughts of things that editors should be considering in a more rigorous fashion.
Well, I think, it's we've got the title Asia Pacific, which is really broad, and I think that probably the key message is that it really depends on each local context or national context, state context. And in the Pacific, you have very different viewpoints if we had someone expert on the Pacific. And again, the key here for blasphemy in Southeast Asia, in Muslim majority Southeast Asia, It's very different, even just in, say, Malaysia and Indonesia. We've seen this week with the Anwar Ibrahim opposition leader jailed with over sodomy charges, that the effect that the government can have in using laws in cracking down on opposition dissenting voices and using Islamic groups to support those, I guess you'd call them draconian laws in the case of, say, Sedition Act, sodomy laws and blasphemy laws as well in Malaysia. So we had a case in Malaysia recently where a Catholic magazine couldn't use the word Allah. So you're not allowed to actually publish that word Allah. This is for the site. Malaysia's decided this is for Malay magazines and Malay publications only. And that, of course, wouldn't happen in Indonesia. So yeah, the local context is really important, and I know that Charlie Hebdo and all of this stuff was really huge recently. And I think for me, the message, I didn't have much to say on that at all. And people were often saying, well, shouldn't you be weighing into this debate? But for me, what was missing a lot in those debates was that people didn't understand the local context of French publications, of French anarchism, and the way that cartoons and the media has that legacy in Paris in particular, that you can't kind of compare to how an Indonesia specialist or a Southeast Asia specialist would comment on freedom of expression. So missing a lot from that discussion was someone giving that really nuanced, detailed local context of Paris anarchist publications. So yeah, I think you're right in that in Australia it's just so different having a secular state without the pressure of religious groups for the most part that there is here, and the big fear that all chief editors fear is these Islamic religious groups really firing up, and this was particularly the case 10 years ago. It's a bit easier now in Indonesia, but if you were a young person and you were writing on social media, I think there's various laws that you could get done for defamation. We have that in Australia. You could get done for kind of information communication kind of laws. But the one thing that you wouldn't want to get done is blasphemy law, because there's no support for the population to get you off that. So you find anyone who's been charged for blasphemy hasn't been able to rally civil society around them. Because it's just hard to fight Islamic groups, I guess, and the majority Islamic population who think that you've got to stand, or who, rightly so, I guess, say that you've got to stand by, not defiling Islam. So it's been really tough, and we've had one case of Alexander Aan in Sumatra, who started an atheist group, and he eventually, in a very kind of strong Islamic part of Indonesia in Sumatra, he was put in jail for 2 years. So it's been really hard to get popular support against those kind of crackdowns of blasphemy laws. Andre, anything to add?
I did. I did have something. It's sort of, I guess, just in terms of blasphemy and I guess, really when I think about the concept of blasphemy, it's hard to really, as a not, similar to you, Eleanor, I was raised Catholic, but now I'm not, sort of agnostic or not very strongly religious, so it's hard to really understand, you have to really try and put yourself into a very different mind frame to really understand, what it is we're talking about when it is blasphemy. As distinct from something that we might have in Australia, like vilifying a certain group or inciting racial hatred. These are laws, I guess, we have in a place like Australia, where there is some level of, I guess, you're looking at what the consequences of an action are. So, you shouldn't say this about this group because it might lead to these bad effects. But blasphemy seems to me, from my understanding of it, that it's, it is this terrible thing in and of itself, because you blaspheme against the very core of that religion. So it's sort of a non-negotiable thing. And I guess the interesting thing for me is then, in the same way that defenders of free speech, and so if you're coming from that very strong liberal background, or even from, like you were saying, Ross, that Charlie Hebdo sort of French anarchist background, the right to free speech, again, it grounds everything that you do, and it is of like absolutely fundamental importance. But then, I guess in terms of blasphemy cases, it's being held up against what, for people who believe, people of faith, this is absolutely core and fundamental to their worldview and to their understanding of their lives. So you sort of, yeah, I guess if we play out the debate in terms of trying to, well, if the debate is played out in this way, you get these two sort of universal beliefs butting up against each other, and it's hard to see a way of saying to someone who is of faith, that you should allow people to blaspheme, but only so much. And it's the same when you go to someone who has a really, really strong view on freedom of expression, to say, oh, you have the right to express yourself, but we want to limit it this much. Like you get from both sides, I guess, a fairly fundamental view of, well, this should never be limited. Yeah, so I find it hard to conceptualize a way of thinking about this conversation in ways that doesn't bring in those universals. Yeah, does that make sense?
Andre, why? Oh no, sorry, Eleanor. Did you want to say something else?
No, I was just going to say that there had been a question posed from Maxine Beneva-Clark to ask if editors had the same view regarding submissions that vilify or critique or criticise non-belief.
Yeah. No, did you want to take that question?
All right then. Look, I would say by and large yes, but again, same as the little caveats that I placed before my previous comments, by and large, in an Australian publishing context that sort of works on a kind of secular presumption, that's a majority view, and so we receive far less comment, and it's almost very hard. I'm like 1 comment to 5. Like that's not a very valuable sample size to deal with this debate right now. But yes, in principle, I think that we would be applying similar kinds of editorial frameworks to someone criticising a broad mainstream secular view that there's it's okay to not believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very simplistic reduction of it, but
and that sort of compares quite directly with, I guess, the example that Ross gave earlier about the guy who's in jail for
establishing
atheism. And Ross, I don't know, it's just this is a stupid question, but is that generally the approach in Indonesia that atheism is seen as a directly blasphemous concept? Is that the case over there in Indonesia?
Yeah, I'm sorry, just cut out a little bit at the end there, but I think your question was about atheism. So obviously you've got to be one of the 6 religions here. You can't be an atheist. And so when you go and tick the census box and all of these things, it'll just say, what is your religion? And so for this individual, Alexander Aan, to starting an atheist group on Facebook, that meant that he was allowed to be charged under these blasphemy laws because, you're saying there is no God. And that's not part of Indonesia's makeup. And so atheism, no one publicly declares to being an atheist. And even though there are many religions in Indonesia, it's an incredibly diverse country. The president has always been a Muslim, and he's like, am I still there? Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, you just froze. And will always be from Java, so you're getting these rules pushed by, and of course the majority Muslim population. So that's something that Indonesia's grappling with, and I think that will always be a contentious issue, the issue of atheism. But you know, certainly in more cosmopolitan cities, and in Jakarta in particular, you are getting more people who, at least privately, are declaring that they're atheists. But it's the same for other issues, say homosexuality, for example. You know, it's very much hidden.
Ross, I just had a question about
Yeah.
about what you were saying about atheism. Just wondering, so the sort of the regional knowledge that I have is more around Vietnam, and so I know that there you have Catholic bloggers will get imprisoned, and also sometimes you have Buddhist activists who are also in prison. But in terms of the reason that they're being put in prison or that they're being silenced, it's more to do with their the fact that their faith leads them to a position of being a dissident. In Indonesia, is, you know, as this guy who sets up an atheist Facebook group, is it because he's also seen as a threat to the power of the state, or is it purely and simply because he's denying the existence of God?
I think that's a really interesting question. That's something I'm really looking forward to learning a bit more about, because I can't put my finger on how it is that certain individuals get found out, or at least get prosecuted or arrested, and others don't, because there is so much that people are saying here that just flies under the radar. And wouldn't surprise me if there are other atheist groups around Indonesia that are on various social media sites. And particularly with this vast array of social media platforms here, so you don't just have Facebook, there's Twitter and Path, which is more a kind of local thing, and WhatsApp and BlackBerry Messenger, and at some point someone has been arrested on each one of those different social media platforms. And I don't think it's as targeted as this, but it doesn't surprise me that at some point someone's been done on BlackBerry, someone's on BlackBerry Messenger, someone's been arrested on Path, someone's been arrested on Facebook and Twitter and on WhatsApp. So the fact that it encompasses all of them kind of makes me think that the state tries to, or Islamic groups in particular, but probably the state really, tries to crack down on each and every one of them at some point, just to warn people, you know, don't go too far on this platform, don't go too far on that platform.
But because I guess in say Malaysia, the example that you brought up of Anwar Ibrahim, I mean in Malaysia, those sodomy charges, you know, everyone's going, well, that's politically motivated because he's a threat to the government. And then in Indonesia, what it sounds like, you know, you're saying about this sort of targeting the platforms, it's about a more general sort of, you know, none of these platforms is entirely safe. Is that?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, particularly the Anwar Ibrahim case, the idea is about, you know, putting him in jail and weakening his political, his ability to win the next election. So there's definitely that. But even before that, the idea was to tap into a huge bunch of Islamic voters who are saying, I'm not going to vote for a guy who's been charged with sodomy. So even before he went to jail, it was difficult for him to gain votes in regions outside of the major cities where there's more freedom of information through the internet and social media, because simply people would say, well, you know, Anwar Ibrahim sodomy, and that's all that mattered. But in this case of Indonesia and these crackdowns on individuals, I think it's going to be a really interesting space to watch in the next 5 years. I mean, as social media becomes more apparent, I mean, there's 25% of Indonesians have Facebook page, and only 15% kind of have access to the internet. That kind of doesn't make sense, but it does in many ways, because people will just get a Facebook page and then check it once a month when they go in from their village into the city, and, you know, have a Facebook account. You can actually, there's people whose job it is to go into little villages, and you pay them 5,000 rupiah, which is about 50 cents, and they'll set up a Facebook page for you. And then later you can go and check the internet and check you got Facebook. So social media has become more and more all-encompassing in Indonesia, which means people are writing more, people are saying stuff, people are being more open, and the state's kind of, and Islamic groups are kind of saying, well, you know, we've got to regulate this, we've got to stop this sometimes, and not just on blasphemy, but on other things, on defamation. There was a case recently in Jogja where someone insulted Jogjakarta culture, and she kind of said they're all, I forget the exact words now, so I don't want to misquote her, but she wrote this on Path, and then she was arrested, and there was this huge uproar as how dare you insult our local culture. So I think there's this real kind of interesting phase at the moment that we're going through in Indonesia as to how do you regulate or at least try and limit freedom of expression via social media. And that's the case too in other countries. You could look at the case of Germany and people being able to write about Nazism or the Holocaust. That local context there where people say, well, we've got to have some kind of regulation. In the same way that Islamic groups here say we have to somehow regulate the way that individuals write about Islam. It can't be a free-for-all. And on social media, it often is a free-for-all. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out in the next few years.
Yeah. I guess we have the example from Australia with Tony Abbott, was it last week or the week before, saying that the social media is just digital graffiti, and that sort of dismissal is clearly a sign that it's a worrying aspect, because if you think about graffiti and street art and that being used as a form of, I guess, anarchism and protest and putting it up to the man approach, then there really is a role for social media in that question of democratization and avoiding authoritarianism and so on. And so I guess we're coming up to the top of the hour, or we're past the top of the hour, but I just wanted to sort of go all the way back to the question that was in the sort of the summary topic for this panel today, which is, what is the role of censorship in an age where almost everyone is connected to each other and everyone has access? Not everyone, that's debatable, but where a lot of people have access and the ability to create content. Andre, I wonder if you might be able to give us your thoughts on that question.
I guess, like for me, it's important to make the distinction between censorship, or at least to define censorship, I guess, as this is something that's relying on state power. So it's censorship to me means when the state using all of its force and its law to control the speech of people within its jurisdiction. That to me is distinct from what sometimes gets called censorship, but to me is more grassroots activism, which is the call for boycotts, and it's very robust discussion about why you shouldn't say certain things, or why you shouldn't make certain jokes, that kind of stuff. So I think the classic example is whenever a comedian gets criticized for making a racist or sexist or whatever joke, they'll turn around and saying, stop censoring me. Especially if people start trying to organize through social media, say like, don't buy a ticket to this person's show, don't go. That sort of boycotting, that gets called censorship, and I think that it's really important to distinguish the two, because I think there's a real role for people to talk and have that conversation and decide to not see something, or decide together that this is a type of speech that we do not support as compassionate people, or whatever it is. And that's completely distinct, I think, from when the state comes in. And I think that's something maybe in the blasphemy space, that's something for people who do feel that a certain type of speech offends their religious sensibilities, that to not be turning towards the state to be enforcing that, and that to find other ways to have the conversation, which I think is what Eleanor was talking about in terms of her practices at Peril, is like to have the conversation rather than to immediately turn to forceful and state-based ways of regulating it.
Eleanor, Ross, did you have anything to add? I think we've got to start wrapping it up soon. So, any final words of wisdom from you guys?
Yeah, look, I think it is easy to say, well, I hope I didn't cut you off there, I'm sorry. It's easy to say, well, we have the we have social media now, and people are saying more things, and the things are getting more free, and internet access is improving, so therefore there's greater freedom of expression, and all of that's true. But I mean, it's also worth recalling or thinking about the increasing kind of concern of crackdown on freedom of expression. Even just today, I read on Reporters Without Borders, they're saying that freedom of the press around the world is drastically in decline. So this is and even in Indonesia, let's use a specific case where just last year there were 52 cases of people being arrested for saying something on social media. So, and that's a huge increase as it was from 2013 or 2012. So these things are a concern, and I think it wouldn't surprise me is as we move forward into the second half of the decade of 2010 that we're going to see more crackdowns on online and social media freedom of expression. We're going to see more government and religious groups having greater voices in Malaysia in the case of cyber troopers. So this is a battleground that will continue to be fought, and just because we have the internet and there is these social media platforms doesn't mean these discussions or issues will go away.
Eleanor, over to you.
Look, and I guess I don't have I only have a couple of small little points to add, which I think are about my residual unease and questions that I guess I've been asking myself in preparing for this panel. And I think that as the proliferation of social media and the changing nature of news and kind of media freedom and people's consumption of news changes, I understand why governments have necessary worries about what that means for their ability to remain on top of such an enormous volume and rapidity of information and information as it changes. But I was really curious in the huge response to the hashtag Je suis Charlie kind of news, that sort of unsettled feeling around how the very small reporting around the alleged Baga, so northern Nigeria massacre that was alleged to take place at the time, like how muted that reporting was for a context and a geography that we often regard violence in Africa as common and unimportant, and we compare that to violence in the global north as being very rare and very important. So I kind of was interested in how, as we have this kind of ever-increasing volume of news and news information, the importance of social media and its kind of clickable, shareable quality to debate, that we're likely to see not just states feeling a desire to be more repressive around that debate, but actually a real limitation to that debate in ways that just reinforce some quite sad power dynamics around, what's important and what's valuable in our communities and cultures. So I don't know. That's not a resolved comment or a statement in any particular large way. It's just a sense of my unease of like, is this the biggest issue in a tolerant and free society? Is it a good issue? But is it the biggest issue? I just wasn't sure.
Yeah, and I guess that point I raised earlier is just that I don't think this is a never-ending conversation. And the fact that we're having it, I think, is great, because this whole debate is one that we're going to keep having for a while. And I've been told to wrap up, so we've got to say goodbye on here for now. But really looking forward to staying in touch via Twitter and all those great aspects of the internet to continue having this debate. So I just wanted to end this discussion. So thank you, everybody. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Congrats to the organisers too.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.